All right, strap in, everybody. Let's fire up the DeLorean, set the date for 1986, and get ready to revisit The Golden Child. You know, that wonderfully bizarre Eddie Murphy movie that somehow mashes together fantasy, martial arts, and comedy?
Unique is definitely the word for it. And it's amazing how a movie that, on the surface seems like just a fun adventure actually deals with some pretty big themes. Like, think about it, cultural appropriation, the clash between Eastern and Western philosophies. It's all in there.
You know, you're right, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. And speaking of clashes, our source material for this deep dive is a transcript from a podcast called Retro Rewind. The hosts, Max and Riley, really dissect The Golden Child with a lot of humor and 80s nostalgia. They point out how inconsistent the movie's tone is, but, it all kind of works.
That's the strange appeal of The Golden Child, right? It really shouldn't work, but somehow it does. And get this, the movie was actually meant to be a much darker action film starring, wait for it, Mel Gibson.
Whoa, hold on. Mel Gibson battling demons in a Himalayan monastery. Someone needs to make that movie. But seriously, how did we go from that to Eddie Murphy's comedic version?
Well, it wasn't just his comedic timing. Sure, he brought in those hilarious one-liners like, who can forget, I want the knife, please. But his presence totally changed the movie's structure, how fast it moved, everything.
So it's like he reshaped the entire movie just by being Eddie Murphy.
Exactly. It's like the studio saw how popular he was and decided to just let Eddie be Eddie. And maybe that wasn't what fans of action movies expected, but it definitely created a space for his comedy to really shine.
And shine it did. Retro Rewind talks about this one scene, Chandler's interrogating a street vendor, and it is pure Eddie Murphy gold. Improvised lines, that physical comedy, and that laugh, it's contagious. They even say that his energy rubs off on the other actors, and they have to match his comedic intensity.
That's what's so great about him in this movie. He's not just telling jokes, he's totally embodying a comedic persona, and that changes the whole feel of the film.
And speaking of changing things up, we can't forget about that super bizarre dream sequence. You know, the one where Chandler goes up against Sardo Nimspa in like a literal hellscape. That's where the whole tonal clash you mentioned really comes into play. 1 minute we're laughing, the next we're in this nightmare world.
It's like the movie's throwing us a curveball.
Yeah.
And visually, that dream sequence is wild. You've got this fiery abyss, all these weird demon creatures, and Sardo in his dark robes torturing souls with this giant flaming hand. It's scary and funny at the same time. And it just shows how the movie embraces the absurd.
Retro Rewind calls it peak 80s cheese, which, okay, maybe it is, but you have to admit those visuals were pretty groundbreaking for the time. This was before CGI was everywhere, so they had to use practical effects and, real imagination.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting how the director uses visuals to connect the slapstick comedy with the more mystical, almost horror elements. Like the lighting and those close-up shots during Sardo's scenes, they create a real sense of danger, even when the movie's being silly.
Right. It's like he's reminding us that even though this is a comedy, there are still real consequences. And it works. Even when Chandler's making jokes about oatmeal, you still feel like things are at stake.
Speaking of things being at stake, we can't forget about the Tibetan mysticism, right? The story is built around this ancient prophecy and finding a mystical child who can, save the world. It's a concept that, looking back, might be a bit problematic, but it definitely introduced Western audiences to some new spiritual ideas.
For sure, it adds this whole layer of mystery and intrigue to the movie. But I wonder, do you think the Tibetan mysticism was just a plot device? Or were they actually trying to explore these spiritual concepts?
That's a great question. Retro Rewind brings that up, too. On one hand, the movie uses Tibetan culture as this exotic backdrop, and that can play into stereotypes. But then there are moments, especially in the scenes with the old man, played by Victor Wong, where you get a glimpse of a deeper understanding of those traditions.
Victor Wong, yes. His character is so grounded and wise. He's like Chandler's spiritual guide, helping him understand this mystical world.
And his presence reminds us that under all the comedy and supernatural stuff, there's some real cultural and spiritual depth. It's what makes The Golden Child more than just a silly comedy. It's a film that tries, even if it's not always perfect, to bridge cultures and introduce Western audiences to Eastern philosophies.
So it's kind of saying, hey, there's a whole world out there. Open your mind and explore it.
And the wild thing is that exploration happens through the lens of 80s pop culture. You have Eddie Murphy, the ultimate 80s comedian, facing off against ancient Tibetan mysticism. It's like two worlds colliding, and somehow it's both entertaining and thought-provoking.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting. Retro Rewind reveals that Charles Dance, who plays Sardo, the villain, took the role to break into Hollywood. He later said that the character turned out way more cartoonish than he expected.
It's like everyone involved was figuring out what kind of movie they were making as they went along. You have this serious actor trying to play a menacing villain, while Eddie Murphy's turning the whole thing into a comedy.
Yeah. And somehow it works. The clashing tones, those crazy plot twists, and Eddie Murphy's just pure charisma, it all comes together to create this movie you can't forget.
It's a testament to the film's energy and how it goes against expectations. It keeps surprising you, making you laugh when you least expect it.
And that's the magic of The Golden Child, right? It embraces how absurd it is and just invites us to go along for the ride. It's a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected combinations can create something truly special.
And speaking of unexpected combinations, let's talk music. Alan Silvestri, who just scored Back to the Future, brought those signature 80s synths to The Golden Child, and the result, a score that totally nails the film's quirky, otherworldly vibe.
Ah, those 80s synth, they were like a time machine transporting you to another dimension. And in The Golden Child, they totally work with the mix of fantasy and comedy. It's like a soundtrack for a mystical adventure that takes place in an arcade.
And since we're on the topic of 80s pop culture, who could forget that Pepsi commercial with the Golden Child theme? Talk about cultural impact.
Oh yeah, that commercial was everywhere. It's classic 80s marketing, combining a huge soft drink with a blockbuster movie. But it also shows how the movie went beyond just being a film. It became part of the conversation.
Exactly. The Golden Child wasn't just a movie, it was a phenomenon. Merchandise, Halloween costumes, you name it. It even popped up in other pop culture references.
Which is wild considering Eddie Murphy wasn't totally happy with how the movie turned out. Retro Rewind mentions that he thought the editing didn't really reflect his comedic style.
That's interesting, right? Makes you think about how much control a director has versus the studio. How much of the original idea survived editing. It's a reminder that making movies is a team effort, and sometimes compromises have to happen.
It makes you wonder what Eddie Murphy's original vision was. Was it even funnier? More action-packed? We may never know, but it shows that even behind the scenes of a seemingly fun movie, there can be creative struggles.
And yet, even with those challenges, The Golden Child still became a cult classic.
Proof that it found an audience that really connected with it.
It definitely resonated with people, that's for sure. I mean, it's a movie that people keep coming back to. They quote the lines, they share the best scenes. It's like a shared experience.
It makes you wonder, though, how The Golden Child would be received if it came out today. I mean, some of the jokes, how it portrays Tibetan culture, it might not go over so well with a modern audience.
Yeah, you're right. Some aspects of the film, especially how it depicts Asian culture and spirituality, would definitely be viewed differently now. We're a lot more sensitive to those things.
It shows how much things have changed in terms of cultural sensitivity and representation in film.
Definitely. Filmmakers have a responsibility to portray cultures accurately and respectfully. But even with its flaws, The Golden Child is still a fun movie. It's got this unique blend of elements you don't really see much anymore.
It's one of those movies you can just relax and enjoy without overthinking it, and sometimes that's what we need.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that not every film needs to be a masterpiece or make a huge statement. Sometimes a good laugh and a crazy adventure are enough to make you feel good.
And The Golden Child definitely delivers on both of those things. It's proof that laughter is a powerful thing, even when you're dealing with supernatural beings.
And it makes you think about the film's legacy. It reached cult classic status, which means it found an audience that really connected with it. And they keep that appreciation alive, passing it on to new generations.
It's amazing how a movie can stick with people long after it's released. It says a lot about the power of good storytelling.
And it's funny, The Golden Child wasn't even one of Eddie Murphy's biggest hits. You know, I mean, he had Beverly Hills Cop and Coming to America. Those were huge. But it's interesting how those smaller films sometimes become cult classics.
Right, they become these hidden gems that a smaller but really passionate group of people discover and love.
It's like finding a rare vinyl record in a dusty old store. It might not be the most popular or well-known, but it's special.
Exactly, it's something you want to share with other people who might appreciate it.
The Golden Child might not be perfect, but it's a great example of 80s filmmaking, with all its quirks and charm.
And it reminds us that sometimes the most unexpected things can come together and create something really entertaining and memorable. The Golden Child, with its mix of action, fantasy, humor, and Tibetan mysticism, definitely left its mark.
Absolutely. It encourages us to embrace things that are different, Things that are quirky and unexpected.
And to appreciate movies that dared to be different, even if they weren't flawless.
You know, speaking of daring to be different, The Golden Child kind of paved the way for genre mashups in Hollywood.
Wait, really? You know, I never thought about it that way, but you're right. It's like a precursor to films like Big Trouble in Little China and even Ghostbusters in a way. They all mixed genres, embraced humor, and weren't afraid to get a little weird.
Exactly. The Golden Child showed that you could have action, fantasy, comedy, even a little horror, all in the same movie.
And it wasn't just about throwing everything together, it was about making those elements work together.
It's like making a dish with ingredients that don't usually go together. You might be surprised by the result.
The Golden Child definitely serves up a surprising and satisfying experience. It reminds us that sometimes the most unlikely combinations can lead to the most rewarding discoveries.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into The Golden Child, let's think about its impact on film and pop culture. It challenged conventions, entertained people, and left behind a legacy of laughter and a sense of wonder.
It's a movie that reminds us that even the most unexpected stories can capture our imaginations and stay with us.
And it reminds us to be open to new experiences, to embrace the strange and wonderful, and to never forget the power of laughter.
And with that, our journey back to 1986 and the world of The Golden Child comes to an end. So we've really dug deep into The Golden Child, from its beginnings as a dark action movie to its transformation into an Eddie Murphy comedy and its lasting effect on pop culture.
Yeah, we've looked at its unique mix of genres, the memorable characters, and even its sometimes problematic take on Tibetan culture. We talked about its status as a cult classic and how it influenced the way Hollywood mixes genres.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with something to think about. Retro Rewind asks a really interesting question. Could The Golden Child be remade today?
It's a cool idea, right?
Yeah.
Imagine a modern filmmaker taking this concept, all the action, fantasy, humor, and spirituality, and updating it for a new audience. What would they keep? What would they change?
I think the basic idea, the cynical social worker thrown into this mystical world to save a chosen one, that's still relevant today. It's like a classic fish out of water story.
Yeah, I agree. And the whole dynamic between the skeptic and the believer, like Chandler and the old man, could be explored in some really interesting ways.
Of course, a remake would have to be careful about how it portrays Tibetan mysticism, be sensitive to the culture.
Absolutely. They'd need to get input from Tibetan people to make sure it's authentic and respectful.
Maybe they could even change things up and make the Golden Child a girl.
Oh, wow, yeah. A female golden child in a male-dominated society, that adds a whole new layer to the story.
So the possibilities are endless for a Golden Child remake. It shows how strong the original film was, how it can still make us think and imagine.
It proves that even older movies can inspire new stories.
We want to know what you think. Do you think a Golden Child remake would work? What would you keep from the original, and what would you change?
Let us know on social media. We always love hearing from our listeners.
That's all for our deep dive into The Golden Child. We hope you enjoyed this trip back to 1986.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.